In this short video, we will look at the building blocks of Fitch Ratings structured finance and covered bonds counterparty criteria. These cross-sector criteria apply to all new and existing structured finance and covered bonds transactions globally for both international and national scale ratings. They provide a framework for analyzing counterparty risk in structured finance and covered bonds, which is generally defined as any risk resulting from a counterparty exposure that could ultimately affect transaction performance. It is worth noting that, in addition to the main criteria report, Fitch publishes a derivative addendum that specifically focuses on how we analyze derivative counterparty exposures, including interest rate and currency swaps. Fitch does not believe it is possible to fully structure away counterparty risk. However, risk can be minimized, and these criteria outline the key principles Fitch uses to determine counterparty risk in a structured finance transaction, as well as its subsequent effect on the maximum rating level that may be assigned to structured finance bonds. If sufficient isolation from any counterparty risk is not achieved, the structured finance rating may not exceed the rating of the counterparty introducing such risk. The counterparty criteria are one of three cross-sector criteria that Fitch applies in the analysis of all structured finance and covered bonds instruments. The other two are used in the analysis of country risk and interest rate risk, as shown on the chart here. The counterparty criteria are used in conjunction with the relevant master criteria for structured finance or covered bonds, as well as the applicable sector-specific criteria, depending on the asset type of the rated instrument. The counterparty criteria encompass three key rating considerations. 1. Fitch's overall rating framework. This describes the process for determining the extent to which structured finance or covered bonds ratings can be delinked from a counterparty rating. 2. Key counterparty risks in a transaction, which detail common exposures and risks Fitch has observed in structured finance and covered bonds. 3. A review of Fitch's counterparty criteria against the provisions included in the transaction documents. Let's first review the rating framework and here under the risk classification. To analyze counterparty risk, we first determine whether the counterparty exposure relates to operational risk, credit risk, or a combination of both. Operational risks include asset pool servicing, administration and ancillary services, asset management, and the application of available funds through the transaction's priority of payments. Credit risk results from the transaction incurring a loss of cash flows due to a counterparty being unable to meet its financial obligations, or from the loss of transaction funds at the time of the counterparty's default. Examples of credit exposures include derivatives, liquidity providers, and any entity holding transaction funds. Second, credit risks are classified into 4 levels: excessive, primary, secondary, and immaterial. Operational risks are associated only with excessive and immaterial risk levels. Lastly, based on the risk and available structural and asset mitigants, Fitch determines the extent to which bond ratings can be delinked from those of the related counterparty. For immaterial risks, the counterparty rating does not constrain the bond ratings, as the exposure does not increase transaction risk enough to affect the bonds. Conversely, excessive risk exposures are material and prevent bond ratings from being delinked from the counterparty rating, even with remedial actions. Here, the counterparty is the primary risk driver rather than the asset pool. For primary and secondary risks, a counterparty default raises the risk of bond default. Secondary risks may be mitigated by certain factors, reducing the impact of counterparty default. In such cases, Fitch expects the counterparty to maintain minimum ratings consistent with its credit risk rating table, for the bonds to achieve ratings above those of the counterparty introducing the risk. For structured finance bond ratings of AAA, Fitch expects counterparties posing primary risks to be rated at least A, or F1, and those posing secondary risks at least BBB, or F2. The criteria section on key counterparty exposures outlines which exposures Fitch considers primary or secondary risks. Minimum ratings must always be supported by remedial actions if a counterparty is downgraded below these thresholds. Remedial actions depend on the counterparty's role and typically involve replacement or a guarantee from another entity within 60 calendar days, provided the new counterparty or guarantor meets Fitch's minimum ratings. Collateralization, pre-funding, or posting a cash reserve are also acceptable remedies for specific counterparty risks. Different minimum secondary risk ratings may apply to derivative exposures, as detailed in the derivative addendum. Next, let's look at key counterparty risks. Key counterparty risks include the transaction account bank, the bank holding the funds in the name of the issuer or trust. In some jurisdictions, this role is often performed by a trustee, in addition to other operational obligations. The servicer, the counterparty responsible for collecting cash flows from the asset pool. Fitch reviews 3 counterparty risks connected to this role: payment interruption risk, commingling risk, and servicing disruption risk. The collection account bank. If appointed, this is the entity typically holding funds in the name of the servicer for a short period before transferring them to the transaction account bank. Risks associated with this entity also include commingling and payment interruption risk. Other key counterparty exposures include liquidity providers, advancing agents, derivative providers, and conditions for qualified investments of transaction account funds. Details on how Fitch approaches these risks and counterparties are provided in the criteria report. While the counterparty criteria detail Fitch's approach to the most common counterparty exposures, in structured finance and covered bonds, Fitch reviews a transaction's exposure to all counterparties that could have a sizable impact on its performance. Examples include paying agents, trustees, and exposures connected to synthetic securitizations. Dedicated sections in the counterparty criteria address certain specific exposures related to covered bonds and national scale ratings. The last element addresses situations in which transaction documents differ from the provisions contemplated by Fitch's counterparty criteria, or in which counterparties fail to execute contractual remedial actions. If transaction documents address counterparty risk differently from Fitch's criteria, Fitch assesses the materiality of the counterparty exposure and the identified differences to determine their possible impact on the instrument's maximum achievable rating. If a counterparty fails to implement required remedial actions, Fitch will place potentially affected structured finance bonds on Rating Watch Negative, or RWN, while the rating implications are analyzed. This review is conducted case by case and considers the unique circumstances of each transaction. This concludes this presentation. For more information, please see the dedicated Structured Finance Criteria page on the Fitch Ratings website.